Right now, in classrooms and flight simulators and small regional airports across this country, there are aspiring pilots. Young men and women who looked up at the sky and decided they wanted to spend their lives there professionally. Some of them are in their early 20s, fresh out of high school, trying to figure out how to finance something that costs as much as a house in a mid-sized American city. Some of them are career changers who spent a decade doing something else and finally decided to chase the thing they actually wanted to do. Some of them are military veterans with real stick time who discovered that translating what they already know into a civilian certificate costs far more than they budgeted for. All of them ran the same set of numbers, and all of them hit the same wall, and an enormous number of them quietly gave up and found a different path. That's not a small story. That's the story underneath every airline capacity headline, every regional carrier struggling to staff their routes, every time you've sat on a regional jet waiting for a crew that was delayed because someone called out sick and there was no one sitting reserved to cover the trip. The pilot shortage is real, the numbers behind it are real, and the training pipeline that's supposed to solve it is, by almost every honest measure, actively making the problem worse rather than better. Before we get into the full breakdown, hit subscribe because this channel covers the financial side of aviation in a way that most people aren't doing, and if you want to understand where flight training costs, airline hiring, and the economics of building a pilot career are actually headed, this is the kind of analysis you are going to want to keep up with. Let me set the stage properly, because you need to understand the full picture before the individual numbers start making sense. A generation ago, becoming a commercial pilot in the United States was expensive by any reasonable standard. But it was the kind of expensive that a motivated, financially disciplined person could actually navigate without destroying their financial life in the process. The path existed, the math was hard but workable, and the career on the other side paid well enough that the investment, while significant, had a reasonably clear payback timeline that a young person could actually believe in. That equation has come completely apart over the last 15 to 20 years, and it's come apart in several directions simultaneously, which is exactly why the problem is so stubborn and why every announced solution seems to fix one piece while the other pieces keep getting worse. Start with the raw numbers, because this is where it gets genuinely difficult to process if you haven't been watching this closely. The total cost to go from zero flight experience to a first officer seat at a regional airline, following the standard professional pathway, is now running between $80,000 and $120,000 at most reputable programs, and at some of the major university aviation programs and large flight academies, that number can push considerably higher once you factor in tuition, fees, housing during the program, and the loss of income during years of full-time training rather than working. We're talking about a financial commitment in the same category as a graduate degree at a private university, except with one crucial difference that almost no one in the industry talks about honestly enough. The payback timeline is far, far worse. When a doctor or a lawyer graduates with enormous student debt, the income they step into, while delayed, is also very substantial. The debt is painful, but there's a credible story about how it gets paid back. When a pilot graduates from a flight academy with $100,000 in student loan debt and steps into a first officer seat at a regional carrier, they're stepping into a job that starts somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 to $60,000 a year, sometimes meaningfully less at smaller regionals, sometimes a little more at the better-paying ones. Running the math on paying back six figures of student debt on a regional airline first officer's salary, while also paying for food and housing and transportation in whatever city you're based in, is an exercise in financial pain that would genuinely shock most people outside the industry if they saw it laid out clearly. And here's the part that makes that already difficult math even harder. You don't get to the regional airline seat immediately after finishing your commercial certificate and instrument rating. You have to build time first, because the Federal Aviation Administration requires that airline pilots hold an airline transport pilot certificate, and getting that certificate requires 1,500 hours of total flight time for the civilian pathway. Which means that after spending $100,000 on training, a new commercial pilot with a couple hundred hours of flight time has to go find work that will pay them to fly and build the remaining hours. That work, flight instructing at a flight school, banner towing, pipeline patrol, ferrying aircraft, exists, but it doesn't pay well, and some of it requires you to invest further in additional certificates or ratings before anyone will hire you for it. Flight instructing, which is the most common route and the one most programs actively steer their graduates toward, typically pays somewhere between $20,000 and $40,000 annually at most smaller flight schools, and the work is demanding, inconsistent in some markets, and can take 2 or 3 years of grinding to actually accumulate enough hours to apply for that regional job. So the actual financial picture for a pilot following the standard civilian pathway looks something like this. Spend $100,000 or more on initial training. Spend 2 to 3 years earning poverty-level wages as a flight instructor while building hours. Get hired at a regional airline at a salary that starts low. Improve slowly over several years as you build seniority and upgrade from first officer to captain, and eventually reach a career income level that a genuinely competitive professional career probably starts at, not peaks at, somewhere 8 to 12 years into the journey. During that entire time, the student debt from the original training is compounding, the interest is running, and the financial hole is either growing or barely shrinking depending on whether the math on a regional first officer's salary even allows for meaningful loan payments after the basics of living are covered. This is why the retention problem at regional airlines is not a mystery. This is why pilots who actually make it through this gauntlet and build the hours and get the regional job frequently spend their time at the regional, aggressively working to get hired at a major airline as fast as possible, because the major airline pay scales are genuinely transformative compared to the regional scales, and the career finally starts making financial sense in retrospect. But that rushing toward the major also means experienced regional captains, the people training the next generation of first officers, are cycling out as fast as they can possibly manage, which creates a perpetual experience deficit at exactly the level of the system that needs experienced people the most. The numbers behind training costs have not moved gently upward over time. They have moved in a direction that, honestly, defies easy explanation until you start pulling apart the individual cost drivers and understanding why each one of them has moved the way it has. Aircraft operating costs sit at the center of this, because every hour of flight training requires an airplane, fuel, maintenance, and insurance. And every one of those individual components has gotten meaningfully more expensive over the last decade, in ways that compound on each other rather than offsetting. Avgas, the fuel that powers most training aircraft, has roughly doubled in price over the last decade at many airports, and at some locations the price increases have been even more dramatic than that when local supply chain issues layer on top of the broader cost environment. A training airplane burning 10 gallons per hour of flight instruction is consuming that cost directly, and the flight school has no choice but to pass it to the student, because the margin in flight training, even at the prices students are paying today, is thin enough that absorbing a fuel price increase isn't a real option for most operators. Aircraft maintenance has its own separate escalation story, and it's one worth understanding in some detail because it drives a significant share of what students actually pay per hour. Training aircraft, by the nature of their use, get flown hard. They're operated at or near max gross weight frequently. They do repeated takeoffs and landings that stress the airframe and landing gear in ways that cruise flying simply doesn't. And the pilots flying them are, by definition, developing their skills, which means the aircraft are being operated by people who are still learning how to operate them smoothly. That's not a criticism, it's just the reality of what a training airplane's life looks like, and that reality produces maintenance requirements that are genuinely significant. Engine overhauls on common training aircraft engines run between $30,000 and $50,000 or more, and that cost gets spread across however many flight hours the engine produces before it needs an overhaul, which means every flight hour carries a meaningful reserve for the eventual engine replacement. When you add in avionics maintenance on glass panel aircraft, airframe inspections, regulatory compliance requirements, and the general labor cost of maintaining certified aircraft, the numbers add up to a per-hour cost of operation that makes the rate students pay feel less outrageous and more like a barely functional business model for the school. Maintenance labor itself has followed exactly the same trajectory as aviation generally, which is to say, the people qualified to work on certified aircraft have become scarcer and more expensive simultaneously, and training operations have not been immune to that pressure. An airframe and power plant mechanic who services a flight school's training fleet is not someone you replace easily if they leave, and the pipeline of newly licensed mechanics has not kept pace with the demand, which has driven compensation upward and created a situation at some smaller training operations where maintenance scheduling becomes a genuine operational bottleneck, taking airplanes out of service for longer than they would have been taken out of service a decade ago, when qualified labor was somewhat easier to find. Aircraft insurance for flight training operations has its own chapter in this story, and it is not a short chapter. Training operations carry a liability exposure that underwrites have been pricing upward for reasons that anyone who's spent time in the aviation insurance market understands clearly, even if it doesn't get discussed openly in industry press very often. Student pilots make mistakes, the accidents associated with training operations happen, and the liability claims that flow from those incidents have driven premiums higher across the industry. Flight schools absorb those premiums as a cost of business, and those premiums show up, eventually, in what students pay per flight hour. At some larger operations, the insurance cost structure is genuinely significant, and at smaller operations where the insured fleet might be only a handful of aircraft, a single bad year in terms of incidents can produce a premium renewal conversation that fundamentally threatens the school's financial model. The aircraft themselves, the actual training airplanes that students sit in and learn from, have followed exactly the price trajectory that was covered in general terms in other discussions of new aircraft pricing. A new Cessna 172, still the most ubiquitous training airplane in the United States and probably the world, now costs something in the neighborhood of $400,000 or more for a fully equipped version with a modern glass panel, which is what most serious training operations buy, because glass panel proficiency has become an effective requirement for the professional pathway. That is a staggering number for an airframe whose fundamental design is decades old, and it is a number that flight schools have to amortize over the aircraft's service life and build into per-hour rates, which means every student flying a new training airplane is carrying a share of that capital cost in the rate they pay. Flight schools that can't afford to buy new airplanes fly used ones, which sounds like a budget solution until you look at what a decent used training aircraft actually costs in the current market, and then at what the maintenance costs on an older airframe typically look like compared to a newer one. A well-equipped used Cessna 172 in training-appropriate condition doesn't cost $400,000, but it doesn't cost $50,000 either, and the maintenance budget on an older airframe, especially one that has been flown hard for decades in training service, can make the per-hour economics look almost as painful as owning new, just in a different form. The money that doesn't go into the purchase price tends to show up in the maintenance account, and sometimes with less predictability, which creates its own kind of cash flow problem for an operator trying to plan a budget and a rate structure. Staffing has become its own crisis within the crisis, and the way it's developed is genuinely self-referential in a way that's almost hard to believe from the outside. The most common source of flight instructors at civilian training programs is, and has been for a long time, recently certificated pilots building time toward the hours required for an airline transport pilot certificate. This makes intuitive sense as a system. You need time. You instruct. The school gets a relatively inexpensive instructor. The student gets an instructor who is actively working on their own skills and staying current, and everyone gets something they need out of the arrangement. The problem with that system in the current environment is the same problem showing up everywhere in the professional training pipeline. The financial deal for a newly certificated flight instructor has gotten significantly worse even as the demand for flight instruction has increased. A pilot who just spent $100,000 or more on their training, who is sitting on that debt, who is watching the regional airline signing bonuses and starting pay packages get incrementally better as the pilot shortage deepens, is calculating whether spending 2 to 3 years at a flight school instructor wage makes sense relative to any alternative that might build hours faster or pay better while building them. Some of those pilots decide the instructing route makes sense and take it. A meaningful and growing number are finding creative alternatives, and the result is that the instructor pipeline is itself thinning at some programs exactly when it needs to be growing to serve increasing student demand. The instructors who are at these schools, particularly the better ones, who have developed real teaching ability and accumulated substantial experience, are also the instructors who get hired away by the regional airlines fastest. Airlines have been aggressively recruiting instructors from civilian flight schools for long enough now that it has fundamentally changed the staffing dynamics at many programs. A flight school invests time and resources in a new instructor, that instructor develops skills and accumulates hours, and somewhere between the 12 and 24-month mark, an airline makes an offer that is financially irrational to refuse, and the instructor is gone. The school starts over. The students who had been flying with that instructor face a transition to a new one, which has real educational consequences in terms of continuity and consistency. This cycle is not hypothetical or rare. It is the operational reality at a significant share of the civilian training programs in this country right now, and it costs everyone involved something. just at different points in the chain. University aviation programs sit in a particularly interesting position within all of this, because they carry their own separate set of cost drivers that don't show up in the same form at independent flight schools. A four-year university aviation program that leads to both a degree and the commercial certificate with instrument rating and the hours needed for the ATP pathway is, in theory, a very attractive option for a student who wants both the degree and the flying credentials. In practice, the cost of combining 4 years of university tuition with the embedded flight training costs has pushed these programs to totals that can genuinely exceed $200,000 at some schools, when everything is accounted for honestly. And the debt load that comes with that, layered on top of the first officer salary reality we already talked about, produces a financial picture that is difficult to frame optimistically. Some of these programs have responded by building airline partnership agreements that offer guaranteed interview pathways, flow agreements, and sometimes signing bonuses or tuition assistance that partially address the financial gap. Those agreements have real value and deserve credit for trying to restructure the economics of the deal. But guaranteed interviews are not guaranteed jobs. Flow agreements depend on both programs remaining intact on both ends of the agreement for the duration of the pipeline, and the partial tuition assistance that airlines are currently offering, while genuinely helpful, doesn't close the full gap between what training costs and what first officer pay is able to service in terms of debt. The math is better with those agreements than without them. The math is still not good in any absolute sense. The financing question deserves its own section because it is genuinely one of the most underexamined parts of this story. There is no equivalent of the federal student loan system for flight training that works cleanly and at scale. Technically, flight training can be included in federal student loan eligibility if it's part of a degree program at a qualified institution, which is one reason university aviation programs remain attractive despite their cost, because federal loan access changes what's financeable even if it doesn't change the total debt. But for students at standalone flight academies or independent flight schools who are not enrolled in a degree program, the financing picture is significantly messier, typically involving private loans at rates that are higher than federal student loan rates, shorter repayment windows, and less borrower protective terms than the federal program offers. Some flight academies have built financing partnerships with specific lenders to streamline the process for their students, and those arrangements help in the sense that they make the transaction easier to complete. They don't change the underlying economics of what the student is committing to. A private loan at 8 or 10 or 12% interest on a $100,000 training cost is a meaningfully different financial burden than a federal student loan at current federal rates would be, and the difference compounds over a repayment timeline. Students who go through these programs and rely on private financing are, in many cases, taking on a debt whose real cost, interest included over a realistic repayment period, is substantially higher than the nominal training cost, and almost none of the marketing around flight training programs gives that number honestly or prominently. There is also a meaningful predatory lending concern in some corners of this market that deserves to be said plainly. The combination of a high-aspiration student body, a shortage of freely available financing alternatives, and training programs that have a strong financial incentive to enroll students creates conditions that have, in documented cases, produced outcomes that were not good for the students involved. Not every flight school behaves this way. The majority of flight training operations are run by people who genuinely care about aviation and about their students' success. But the financial architecture of the industry has enough gaps and enough misaligned incentives that a student who doesn't do thorough independent research before signing anything is exposed to real risk, and that risk is not evenly distributed across the population of aspiring pilots. Students from lower-income backgrounds, students who are the first in their families to interact with professional aviation, students without connections to people who can walk them through what to watch out for. These are the students most likely to end up in the worst financial situations, and the industry doesn't talk about that clearly enough. Military aviation is the alternative pathway that people often raise at this point in the conversation, and it is worth engaging with seriously rather than dismissing, because for some candidates, it genuinely is the right answer. Military aviation training is effectively paid for by the taxpayer. The pay during training and during service is real and livable, and pilots who complete military service and transition to civilian aviation arrive with substantial hours, aircraft type experience, and a track record that civilian employers find very attractive. The signing bonuses and preferential hiring arrangements that the major airlines have built for military transition pilots are a real and substantial part of the industry's attempt to address the shortage. But the military pathway has genuine constraints that make it a partial solution rather than a complete one. Military aviation is competitive to enter in ways that flight training is not, and the selectivity of the military flight training pipeline means it can absorb a limited number of candidates regardless of how many people want to pursue it. Service commitment requirements mean that a military pilot's timeline to the civilian cockpit is not a short one, typically a decade or more of active duty obligation before the pilot is genuinely free to transition, which means the military pipeline's output has a long lag time relative to when civilian demand for pilots is being felt. And crucially, the number of military pilots transitioning to civilian aviation each year, while meaningful, has not come close to filling the gap that the civilian training pipeline is leaving, and projections suggest that gap is going to widen rather than narrow over the next decade, regardless of what happens on the military side. International training is another piece of this conversation, specifically the practice of American aspiring pilots going to flight training programs in countries where the training costs are meaningfully lower due to lower labor costs, lower fuel costs, or different regulatory environments that allow training to proceed differently than it does under FAA oversight. Some of these programs are legitimate and produce well-trained pilots who successfully validate their international credentials for FAA certificates. Some of them are, to varying degrees, not that, and sorting out which is which from outside the system as a prospective student is genuinely difficult without significant research and aviation-specific advice. The broader point about international training is that the fact it exists as a meaningful consideration at all says something important about the domestic training market. When the cost differential between training in the United States and training in another country is large enough that aspiring American pilots are genuinely willing to move to another country for a year or two to complete their training, the domestic pricing structure has a serious problem. That problem doesn't get solved by individual students finding workarounds. It gets solved, if it gets solved, at the level of the structural cost drivers we've been talking about, and right now, very few of those structural cost drivers are moving in the right direction. The pilot shortage itself has been declared officially and repeatedly for long enough now that it's worth asking why declaration after declaration hasn't produced a corresponding solution, because there is clearly something in the structure of the problem that makes it resistant to the standard market responses that should, in theory, fix a labor shortage in any normal industry. In a normal labor market, when there is a shortage of workers in a specific skill category, wages in that category rise. The higher wages attract more people to the career, and over whatever training and development timeline applies to that skill, the supply of workers increases until the shortage resolves. This works better in some industries than others and over different time horizons, but it is a reasonably reliable mechanism over long enough periods. Aviation has seen real wage increases at the major carrier level, genuinely transformative increases from where major airline captain pay was sitting a decade ago to where it sits now. Those increases are real, and they matter, and they deserve credit for beginning to address one part of the equation. But the mechanism breaks down in aviation, because the lag time between deciding to become a pilot and being qualified to fill a shortage-level job is not months. It's the better part of a decade, from initial training through hour building, through the regional pathway to the major airline seat, where the pay is genuinely competitive with other high-skill professional careers. During that decade, the aspiring pilot is not earning at the level that attracted them to the career. They are surviving on the early career wages while paying back the training debt and waiting for the career to become what they were told it would be. The number of people willing and financially able to commit to that full decade-long journey, front-loaded with enormous expense and early career financial pain, in exchange for an outcome that is theoretically very good, but is genuinely a decade away, is smaller than the industry's projections about the pipeline seem to account for. The regional airline piece of this deserves direct attention because the regionals are both the symptom and, in some ways, the mechanism of the problem feeding back on itself. Regional airlines exist to provide service to smaller markets under code-share arrangements with major carriers, and they operate on cost structures that require lower labor costs than the majors to make the economics of thin-margin regional routes work. That structural reality has meant that regional first officer pay has historically been significantly below what the major airlines pay, and it is that pay gap between where a pilot starts their airline career and where they eventually wants to be that creates the financial chasm a pilot has to survive for several years. The regional airlines have raised starting pay substantially over the last several years, under competitive pressure from each other and from the reality of not being able to staff their operation otherwise. Some regionals now advertise first officer starting pay that is meaningfully better than it was 5 years ago, but raising regional starting pay solves the early career cash flow problem without fully solving the debt service problem if the training cost has also continued to increase, which it has. The marginal improvement in regional starting pay has not kept pace with the marginal increase in training costs, which means the total financial deal for a new entrant into the civilian pilot pipeline is not substantially better today than it was when the shortage was first being widely discussed. It's just worse in slightly different proportions. There is also a retention problem within the regional system that has its own financial dimensions. Regional airlines have invested heavily in flow-through agreements with major airline partners, promising their pilots that after a defined number of years at the regional and a defined amount of experience accumulated, they will have a pathway to the partnered major. These agreements have real value, and many of them have actually worked as advertised. But they also create a culture at the regional level where pilots are, rationally and understandably, focused on accumulating the experience needed to move up, rather than on building long-term careers at the regional level. Because the financial incentive to move up is so overwhelming that staying at the regional level indefinitely doesn't make economic sense for most pilots who have the option to leave. The consequence of that rational behavior is that regional airlines are perpetually operating with a workforce that has a significant number of pilots in the early and middle phases of their tenure who are actively planning to leave as soon as their contractual or experience thresholds are met. Planning a training and staffing operation around that reality is genuinely difficult, and it contributes to the chronic instability in regional staffing that produces the service disruptions that passengers experience and that generate news coverage that, ironically, sometimes discourages aspiring pilots from seeing regional airlines as an appealing career waypoint, which makes the recruiting problem worse in a loop that is frustrating to watch from any vantage point inside the industry. Simulator training has become both a potential solution and a new cost layer in the overall picture, and understanding the nuance there matters. Full-motion flight simulators of the type used in airline training programs are extraordinarily capable tools, and the FAA has progressively approved more training credit toward certificate requirements for time spent in qualified flight simulators rather than actual aircraft. This is, in the abstract, genuinely good news for training cost reduction, because running a high-end simulator is expensive, but it is typically less expensive than running the actual aircraft it represents, especially at jet aircraft prices and fuel consumption rates. For candidates who can access high-quality simulator training, the credit toward real-world hour requirements provides a cost reduction that is meaningful even if it doesn't transform the total training cost picture entirely. The access problem is the issue. Full-motion simulators of the type that qualify for meaningful FAA credit are expensive to build and operate, and they are concentrated at large training centers and at airline-operated facilities that are not necessarily accessible to the aspiring student in the early phases of their training. The simulators available at typical flight schools are desktop or fixed-based units that have real training value but don't carry the same FAA credit weight as full-motion devices, and the gap between what's widely accessible and what's maximally credit-generating is a gap that, once again, tends to fall in ways that disadvantage students who don't already have access to well-resourced training environments. The diversity dimension of the pilot shortage is something that gets mentioned frequently in industry discussions and then treated as a separate problem rather than as a directly connected consequence of the financial structure we've been examining. The demographics of the professional pilot community have been stubbornly homogeneous for the entire history of commercial aviation, and the financial barriers to entry that we've been talking about are a direct and significant mechanism of that homogeneity. When a career requires absorbing 6 figures of debt before earning a dime at a professional level, and when the early career wages are as low as they are in the regional system, the career self-selects for people who either come from financial backgrounds that allow them to absorb that cost without the debt being existential, or people who are willing to take on debt levels that are genuinely risky, given the early career income reality. Both of those selection effects skew toward candidates who already have relative financial advantage, and relative financial advantage in this country has a demographic distribution that is well documented. This is not complicated sociology. It is a straightforward consequence of the cost structure. When you make something expensive enough that only certain people can access it, the people who access it reflect the demographics of the people who could afford to. Every initiative aimed at improving diversity in aviation that doesn't simultaneously address the financial barrier to entry is working against a structural current that is much stronger than any program-level intervention, and the results of those initiatives have generally confirmed that addressing the symptom without addressing the cost structure produces modest and temporary improvements rather than durable change. Scholarship programs for aspiring minority and female pilots exist, have been around for decades in various forms, and have produced individual success stories that are real and worth celebrating. They have not changed the aggregate demographic picture in any transformative way because the total financial need vastly exceeds the available scholarship pool, and the most enthusiastic scholarship advocates in the industry would freely acknowledge that scholarships are a workaround for a problem whose real solution requires the underlying cost to come down, not just more funding to help a small number of individuals absorb a cost that remains unchanged. Aviation academies attached to or partially funded by airlines represent perhaps the most structurally interesting attempt to fix the pipeline from the top down, and they deserve real attention because some of them have genuinely innovative economics even if the overall scale remains limited. The basic model: an airline identifies the structural bottleneck in the pilot pipeline and decides that rather than competing for finished pilots, it will invest earlier in the development of pilots it will eventually employ, partially subsidizing the training cost in exchange for a commitment to join the airline after completion and remain for a defined period. This aligns incentives in a way that the standard model doesn't, because the airline is capturing the benefit of the trained pilot it financed, and the student is getting real subsidy in exchange for a commitment that both parties understand going in. The airlines that have built these programs have reported genuine enthusiasm from applicants and real results in terms of the pipeline they're building. The program structures vary significantly in terms of how much of the training cost is covered, what the commitment period looks like, and what happens financially if a pilot leaves before the commitment period is complete. And those details matter enormously for how favorable the economic deal actually is for the candidate. But the fundamental model is sound, and in a world where the training cost cannot be made to meaningfully decrease through cost reduction alone, shifting who bears that cost and how it's repaid is one of the more promising structural interventions available. The limitation is scale. Airline-sponsored academy programs exist at a handful of carriers and train, collectively, a few hundred to a couple thousand pilots annually across the entire industry. The projected shortage numbers involve tens of thousands of pilots over the next decade, and the math between current program capacity and projected need doesn't close anywhere near fast enough to resolve the shortage, even if every airline in the country built and filled an academy program tomorrow. The model is right, the scale is wrong. Getting from one to the other requires investment commitments from airlines that are, understandably, cautious about locking in large capital expenditures on training infrastructure that serves a workforce whose size and composition will need to flex with future demand cycles, and that caution is rational from an airline finance perspective, even when it is frustrating from a systemic perspective. The FAA regulatory environment sits as another layer of this story that is genuinely complex and resists easy characterization. Aviation safety oversight in the United States is serious, thorough, and directly responsible for the safety record that makes commercial aviation as safe as it is. The regulatory requirements that drive a significant share of training costs, the hour requirements for the ATP certificate, the aircraft certification standards that keep training aircraft expensive to manufacture, the instructor qualification requirements that affect how quickly new instructors can be trained and deployed, these are not bureaucratic nonsense. They are, at their foundation, safety requirements that exist because the consequences of inadequate pilot training show up in accident data, and the FAA is ultimately answerable to that accident data in ways that create real conservatism around any proposed relaxation of standards. That said, the regulatory framework was built for a set of circumstances that have changed in some important ways, and there are legitimate debates within the aviation community about whether some specific requirements are calibrated correctly for the current environment. The 1,500-hour requirement for the ATP, specifically the rationale for that number versus a different number, is a debate that has both strong arguments on the safety side and reasonable questions on the pipeline side, and it has been an ongoing conversation in the industry for the better part of a decade without resolution, because the fundamental tension between safety conservatism and pipeline adequacy is genuinely hard to resolve in a way that both sides of the argument find acceptable. The military pathway exemption, which allows military pilots to qualify for the ATP at a lower total hour threshold given the nature of military training, provides an instructive data point. The argument is that military training is intensive and rigorous enough that fewer total hours in military aviation are equivalent in preparedness to more hours in civilian training, and the safety data does not contradict that argument. Extending some version of that logic to particular types of civilian training, structured, intensive, scenario-based training at well-equipped programs, has been proposed in various forms and has not moved forward decisively for reasons that are partly political, partly institutional, and partly genuine disagreement about whether the equivalence argument holds in the civilian context the way it holds in the military one. The technology piece of this story is one of the few areas where there is genuine optimism available if you look carefully. Simulation technology has advanced to the point where the gap between a high-quality fixed-base simulator and a full-motion device is meaningfully smaller than it was a decade ago in terms of the training value delivered, even if the regulatory credit structure hasn't kept pace with the technology improvement. Advanced air mobility, the electric vertical takeoff and landing category, and the broader autonomous and semi-autonomous aviation space is developing a pilot skill set and operational framework that is genuinely different from conventional aviation, and how those new pathways interact with the existing training and certification system is still being worked out in ways that will matter significantly for the pipeline question over the next decade. Specifically, if well-designed advanced air mobility operations require pilots who are more systems monitor than traditional stick-and-rudder pilot, the training pipeline for those operations might look fundamentally different from the one we've been discussing, potentially shorter, less expensive, and more focused on systems understanding and decision-making than on the accumulated flight hours that drive the cost of the conventional pathway. That's not a certainty, and there are genuine safety arguments for maintaining rigorous standards in any crewed aviation operation, regardless of how much the systems can do autonomously. But the possibility exists that the technology trajectory of aviation is going to create alternative training and certification pathways that don't require $100,000 and a decade of financial pain to produce a competent, employable aviation professional. Whether that happens fast enough to address the current shortage is a different question. The advanced air mobility segment is still in its early operational stages, certification frameworks are still being developed, and the commercial scale that would create significant pilot employment in that category is still several years away at the optimistic end of the projections. For someone who is trying to figure out right now, today, whether they can afford to become a pilot, and whether the career makes sense financially, the advanced air mobility future is real, but it is not an answer to an immediate question. What is an answer to immediate questions, or at least a partial answer, is the current environment at the major carrier level, where the financial case for being a pilot, if you can survive the path to get there, has genuinely become more compelling than at almost any point in the last 20 years. Major airline captain pay at top carriers now routinely runs into the $300,000 to $400,000 range annually for senior captains, with good seniority. And first officer pay at the majors has also moved substantially upward. The financial outcome at the top of the career, if you get there and stay healthy and maintain your medical certificate, is genuinely very good. That good outcome at the top of the career is, however, separated from the current aspiring pilot by a journey of such financial severity in the early stages that a rational person looking at the full picture can very reasonably conclude the risk-adjusted expected value doesn't justify the commitment. The people who do make that commitment are typically not making it purely on financial logic. They're making it because flying is what they want to do at a level deep enough to override the financial analysis, or because they don't have complete information about the full cost and early career income reality, which is a separate and concerning issue, or because they have access to financial resources or family support structures that insulate them from the worst consequences of the early career income gap. That last point is underappreciated. The aspiring pilot who has a family member willing and able to cover training costs, or who has savings from another career, or who has a partner whose income covers the household while the pilot builds hours on a flight instructor's salary, is in a fundamentally different position than the aspiring pilot who has to fully finance their training and fully support themselves through the hour-building phase on what flight instruction actually pays. The career is not impossible for the second person, but it is enormously harder, and the risk of financial distress that permanently ends the career attempt before the airline seat is reached is much higher. The industry knows this, talks about it at conferences, and largely continues to operate in ways that don't change it structurally. The attrition numbers within flight training programs tell a story that the programs themselves are not always eager to publicize. Across the industry, the percentage of students who begin primary flight training with the stated goal of a professional aviation career and actually complete the pathway to a professional pilot position is significantly lower than the enrollment brochures would lead you to believe. Attrition happens at multiple points, when the cost of instrument training or commercial training exceeds what a student can finance after exhausting their original budget, when the student passes a personal minimums check on the financial commitment and decides the ceiling they can see isn't worth the cost of reaching it, when the hour-building phase proves more financially brutal than expected, when a medical disqualification ends the career at any point along the way, before or after the training investment is made. Medical certification is its own dimension of risk in this story that deserves more attention than it usually gets when flight training costs are discussed. A pilot career requires maintaining an FAA medical certificate appropriate to the flying being done, and that certification is not guaranteed indefinitely, regardless of how much you've invested in training. Medical conditions that develop during a career or that are discovered during the initial certification process can ground a pilot temporarily or permanently, and that grounding can happen at any point from before the first training dollar is spent to well into a professional career. The financial exposure from a training investment that gets terminated by a medical disqualification is real, and students beginning expensive training programs should be having honest conversations about their medical history with an aviation medical examiner before committing serious money. But the industry doesn't always make that conversation as prominent as the enrollment conversation, which creates real harm in individual cases. The economic weather at airlines themselves is also part of the backdrop for this story, in ways that can get overlooked when the immediate focus is on the shortage. Commercial aviation has a history of cyclical demand volatility, and the hiring and furlough cycles that follow from that volatility have real and lasting consequences for pilot careers. The pilots who were furloughed during the aviation industry downturns of the past several decades, including the significant downturn that followed the pandemic-era demand collapse, took real financial damage from those furloughs that compounded the existing difficulties of the early career financial picture. A career where you spend the first decade fighting through the financial difficulties of training debt and low regional pay, and then face the possibility of a furlough that resets your income to zero, and potentially your seniority position as well, is a career with a genuine downside risk profile that is hard to fully internalize when you're 18 years old and in love with the idea of flying jets professionally. The current period of very high airline hiring demand is real and is providing a genuine window of career opportunity for pilots who are at or near the qualification threshold for airline jobs. But the history of the industry is cycles, and pilots beginning training today are making a decade-long commitment that will play out through whatever cycles the industry experiences during that period, not just the current favorable environment. Communicating that clearly and honestly to aspiring pilots is part of what responsible flight training programs should be doing, and some of them do it well. Some of them are selling a career in the terms of the best years of the last decade, without fully contextualizing the full cyclical picture. And that gap between what's promised and what the full career reality looks like is part of why attrition happens, and why some pilots arrive at the end of the training journey feeling misled about what they signed up for. The global dimension of this is worth touching on briefly, because the pilot shortage is not a uniquely American problem, and the global context shapes what happens in the American market in ways that aren't always obvious. Rapid aviation market growth in Asia, particularly in China, India, and Southeast Asia, has created enormous demand for trained pilots that the local training pipelines in those regions cannot fully supply, and that demand is actively competing for pilot supply on a global scale. American pilots are not typically moving to fly Chinese or Indian carriers in large numbers, but the global shortage dynamic affects the competitive environment for